Televiziunea Română, întâlnirile JTI și Fundația Art Production vă recomandă Garantat 100%.
Salutare! Bine v-am regăsit la Garantat 100%. Invitatul nostru din seara asta s-a născut în 1956 în Statele Unite ale Americii. Este un foarte apreciat filozof, preocupat printre altele de realismul moral, teoria sentimentelor morale, relația între fapte și valori, judecățile și dilemele morale sau felul actual de înțelegere a autorității politice. Activitatea sa a fost recunoscută în mai multe rânduri prin premii universitare de mare prestigiu. Din 1985 predă la Universitatea din North Carolina și este directorul programului de filozofie, politică și economie al acestei universități. Domnia sa se află în România la invitația Facultății de Filozofie a Universității București. Doamnelor și domnilor, suntem onorați să-i spunem bun venit la Garantat 100% domnului profesor Geoffrey Sayre-McCord. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
I'm honored to be here.
Quite often in Romania, and not only here, when you say, I'm a philosopher, people may ask you, and what is your job? What do you do for a living? Is that happening in the States as well?
Normally in the States, when you say I'm a philosopher, they turn to you and say, and so what are your sayings? And we don't have any nowadays.
Okay.
It is common in the States for someone then to joke, oh, are you working at McDonald's? Which is, they think, the natural career path for somebody who studies philosophy. So, in fact, though, becoming a professional philosopher is not the normal career path for people who study philosophy. Most people who study philosophy go on in business or government or nonprofit organizations.
I will kindly ask you to allow me to raise a somehow Socratic questioning, but with elementary, simple questions. In an exercise to find out if the topics that you deal with in your research can be perceived, understood by people without an intellectually sophisticated training. Okay?
Okay.
Good. What is a moral dilemma?
The first way to answer it, I think, are moral dilemmas are utterly familiar aspects of living a life. They are situations where the decision you face is morally hard. There are things to be said for each of the options that you face, and whichever one you take, you're painfully aware of what's not being done. So they're just something almost everyone faces. When I teach a course for first-year college students. One of the assignments that I especially value is I ask my students to interview someone at least 20 years older than they are about the hardest decision that person's ever had to make that he or she is willing to talk to them about. Where what has to have made it hard was not that she or he knew what was the right thing to do, but couldn't get herself to do it or himself to do it, but rather hard because figuring out which to do was a challenge. I like the assignment because for younger people to realize people they know and admire have faced these decisions is valuable to them in realizing what's at stake. But what they're really doing is they're asking, tell me about a moral dilemma. And it's just something most people have to face at a certain time in their life. It can be when they're very young, of course, but...
Is the idea of moral dilemma really existing?
Well, if you go with the definition I just gave you with, decisions where moral values are at stake and you can't promote them all, I think there's virtually no question they really exist. There's a more technical term of moral dilemma. It's a view captured by the English slogan. I don't know if there's something similar in Romanian, but sometimes people think you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't do something.
We have it as well in Romania.
Okay.
Yep.
So the thought that no matter what you do, you're properly condemned is the thought that there's a special kind of dilemma, not just that it's a hard decision and no matter what, things of importance won't be done, but there's a hard decision defined in such a way that no matter what you do, it's appropriate for you to be condemned. That latter view, I actually think, rests on a mistaken view of morality. But this is a highly contentious view, and it depends very much on the extent to which you think the demands of morality ought to be fair demands, such that everyone has the opportunity to do at least one thing that's permissible, or to see as a legitimate excuse that these were the only options available.
There's a famous quotation from an English writer who said, "No matter how hard a man tries to escape destiny, he remains tributary to it."
Yes.
Is that within this
That
frame?
is within, and then you have to think, what's the significance of that fact of our situation? Does it mean no matter what we're condemned? Or does it mean one thing that's true of us is we can't control all in our life, and that's a reason not to blame us for some things?
Can I find a moral dilemma in my normal life, in one's normal life? Can you give a precise example of a moral dilemma? A practical one.
So, my father was in a car accident that left him in the hospital with no brain activity beyond his brain stem. And the question was, as the eldest son, should he be disconnected from life support? I considered that a dilemma. I considered it a heightened dilemma because at one point in my life, he had asked me if he ever was in a situation like that to help him end his life. He asked me to promise that I would do it, and I refused to make that promise. He also published an article arguing against physician-assisted suicide. So I found myself in a situation where my father's life, at least the biological part of his life, was at stake. Given the laws in Connecticut, it was within our power to disconnect or not disconnect him. I think that was a real life. A lot of people sadly face something like that decision. But there are plenty of decisions in the careers you take, and the cost or promise of those careers for your family or your relationship with your kids. I think too many decisions like that are made without being philosophical about them. I think too often people find themselves at 40 or 50 looking back and thinking what they've lost because of decisions they made doing that more narrow, I have to do this to get the next salary increase, and at the cost of their relationship with their kids. I think that sense of loss that some people feel is a reflection of earlier there being situations that were actually dilemmas, hard choices where different values were at stake, both of which mattered, but that were passed through without recognizing them.
Is there a philosophical strategy in order to work with a moral dilemma? I mean, for a normal human being, is there a philosophical strategy to deal with a moral dilemma?
Well, you might have gotten the sense already. I think of philosophy as continuous with thinking seriously about a broad range of things. especially, but not exclusively, values, responsibilities, the nature of a good life. Those are philosophical topics, it seems to me. The strategy that in my training I hold dear is called an analytic approach. It's familiar for anybody who's studied chemistry, or anybody who's studied organizations, or anybody who's diagnosed a car that's not working. You take challenges or promises and challenges or opportunities, and you break them down into their parts to try to understand all that's in play. That's the analysis part. So often in choices about what sort of career to pursue, or whether to invest more money in your education or take a job, I think a lot of what's valuable is to pause and try to identify all the pieces that are at stake, and then to think about not just their immediate appeal, but their long-term value, and then to consult others who might have advice that you should value and weigh that. That's a philosophical approach to everyday decisions.
So the more you analyze, the more you get a chance in order to solve a moral dilemma.
Up to a point. So I think a lot of people are familiar with overthinking a situation.
Yes.
It's a great way to ruin a romantic relationship.
Yes.
There's one thing that, I'm going to use a metaphor from Plato's Republic. He argued that people are best off if they rule their life by reason. What he had in mind is their life goes best if they're people who ask what's good to do, not necessarily morally good, anything of value, what's good to do. They ask the question, they have the resources to answer the question, and just as importantly, the wherewithal to act on the answer they give themselves. So if you have this sort of Platonic picture of what we're capable of doing, he argues, we can leave this aside, that you're best off if you're like this. But it's an important observation that once you ask what's good to do here, and you answer the question and you act on it, sometimes the right answer is don't overthink it. You'll miss opportunities. There are all sorts of opportunity costs, as they're called in economics, of continuing to think.
So do you recommend to think out of someone's guts, for example?
Sometimes, if you have reason to trust your gut. Now, we all also know people who have ample reason not to trust their gut. Again, going to relationships, people who regularly go into relationships they regret. You say, well, what your reason should tell you is try something different. And if all of those were relationships you got into because you went with your gut, listen to something else, not your gut anymore. But there are other people who have exactly the right instincts, and reflecting on that tells them, go with your instincts. You can trust those. The philosophical aspect of this is recognizing the value of investigating the question, when and why are my guts reliable when they're reliable, and when do they lead me wrong? And that's the part I really think is the most practically valuable aspect of the idea of a philosopher.
But you have to be superhuman to solve all these.
Well, the fact is nobody can solve all of them. And then you have to live with the ones you acted in without solving, and figure out what the right attitude is towards yourself and those who suffered as a result. But there is no wonder drug to pure happiness found in philosophy, but there is an incredibly valuable tool, I think, for pretty much anybody.
So no magic formulas?
No magic formulas. Except I do have one for sale for $29.95 that you can buy on the internet. No magic formulas.
Okay. So we talk a lot in Romania. Sometimes in a nostalgic manner, some other times in a hysterical way, about the lack of values and the moral chaos we live in. Is that happening in the States as well?
Oh, yes. So there's two things on the table there. One is the lack of values, the range of people who are not really asking what's good to do, what's fair, what's just. They're simply asking what will get me ahead without regard to fairness, justice, value, or what will make me money without regard to the fact that money isn't always valuable. Or what do I feel like doing right now? That's an absence of values altogether. Separately, there's this sense of a chaos of values, which emerges in contexts where people are exposed to cultures, subgroups, other people who care about values but embrace different ones, or embrace the same ones with different understandings. And that can feel very chaotic because it's this wonderful word that isn't used often, cacophony.
Yes.
It's this range of sounds, all sounds. So it's not no values at all. It's people caring about things as valuable, but put together, it seems like a mess. And you hear the sounds you resonate to being drowned out by other sounds, and that can feel very threatening. We definitely have that in the United States, and we have a lot of reactions to it. So this course I mentioned, where I ask my first-year students to interview people, their elders, in effect, I teach it in the first year because one of the things in the States that happens is people move from living at home in their families to, in the States, people go to universities living away from home. That's not true everywhere, but it's overwhelmingly true in the United States. And when they get to college, they're all of a sudden exposed to the noise of other values, other lifestyles, other commitments.
Right.
And part of what I love about teaching the first-year students is giving them the tools to think carefully about how to address that variety. Because otherwise what happens is students tend to either just lock down in what they're comfortable with, or basically go crazy. You know, just not think through what the options are. So part of how I see early philosophy is giving people the intellectual tools to sort of pause and reflect on which of these other views are valuable. Maybe just valuable for them, not for me. Which are not valuable at all, they're just bad. Which are dangerous. Those tools, I think, are essential to addressing the cacophony of values in a broad society.
But you act as a sort of a god in this situation.
Who does?
You.
I don't think so at all. I'm very careful not to give the students a clear sense of my own views, except the view that the tools of thinking carefully about the nature of values, given their reason, given their minds, they already have the tools they need, if they have the philosophical tools and the intelligence, to think for themselves through it. And they may come up with conclusions different from mine, but there's a world of difference in their life between having come to that view by thinking about it rather than just locking down in what they happen to have inherited or going crazy without learning from the experiences they're having.
Which leads us to our next question.
Okay.
I know that this happens all over the world, but why do we live this continuous tension to long for values, but not to feel any satisfaction of reaching them through our acts?
Well, I'm not sure how to take your question. So I actually think a lot of people take a lot of satisfaction properly from their kids or from what they do in their job. Not every job offers the opportunity for satisfaction. Not every job is one that you can think, I'm contributing something valuable. All I'm doing is getting something valuable, a salary I can use over here. That itself may be a source of satisfaction. So my first reaction is, I think life for most people is full of frustration. And it's full of frustration partly because they do value things that they find they can't achieve, or they can achieve and then it's lost, or it's achieved and not appreciated. All of those are sources of great frustration. But I think also there's a great deal that is a source of satisfaction, and there's a kind of satisfaction that only comes from achieving things you think are valuable, a kind of pride and sense of accomplishment that if you don't value things, the psychology of it is you're on like a rat on a treadmill. You're running along and it's moving and they're feeding you and they're feeding you, but at no point are you really satisfied, because as soon as the desire for the next bit of food comes, it's satisfied and then a new one arises. You get a car, you want a bigger car. You have a house, you want a bigger house. You have clothes, you want better clothes. But then Plato says, often what you then do is you get rid of the bad feeling, but you don't get anything positively good, and immediately a new desire. And he describes this life. Many people, he thinks, lead their lives like cattle, feeding, fattening, and fornicating with their heads bowed to the ground, doing whatever they can to kill others for the sake of what they want now, never looking up to what's more valuable, what's positively good. So he characterizes a way of living your life that, as you say, is just going to be frustration after frustration, because every apparent success isn't a satisfaction. So all I'm saying is there are a lot of people I think do take pride in their kids and in what they've done with them and what they do as horribly underpaid teachers or working in hospitals caring for the elderly, and I think there's room for a lot of satisfaction, but only if you have values.
Do we, as human beings, really, intimately, honestly, want to live in a moral world?
So you're asking me a question of psychological fact.
Yes.
And I'm not qualified to give a fair answer, an informed answer on that. I am disposed, nonetheless, to distinguish a kind of nightmare where a particular version of morality is imposed on everyone, contrasting that with a kind of freedom to come to an appreciation of morality that I think a lot of people are scared of, understandably.
Yes.
So do people really want to live in a moral world? The question is, here's a particular single picture of what a moral world is. Do people want that? I think probably the answer is a lot of people don't, because a lot of people reasonably think their version of a moral world wouldn't be that one. On the other hand, I think most people appreciate that the world is a better place for them and others if they live among people they can trust who can trust them. In particular, among people they can trust and who can trust them to do their share, to work to promote things of value, to restrain themselves in the face of temptation. Obviously, people are not all trustworthy, and not all people are actually trusted. But I think the value of being trusted and being trustworthy so that people who actually know you can be trusted, I think that's a widely desired state to be in. I think a lot of people do think if that's what you mean by a moral world, yes, I really want to live in it. I want to live in a world where I can trust others, where they can know me and know they can trust me. You might think that and think also, I'm not in that world. Too many people are untrustworthy to lower my guard, but that's not something that those people then think, great. They think that's a loss. So if you'll give me that characterization of moral world, then I think, in fact, most people who have a taste of it really do want to enjoy that if they can.
So there is a taste of morality.
Yeah.
How would you answer if somebody tells you that morality is a construct, is an idea invented, constructed in order to tame the human being?
I kind of adore that we keep coming back to Plato. At the very first book of the Republic, so I was talking before about book 9, book 1, there's a character named Thrasymachus. And he argues that morality is a fiction developed by the powerful to control the weak. And he argues that all these moral rules that are promulgated, if you investigate their history, you'll see that repeatedly they benefit those in power. And isn't it right to suspect they're just there to make the powerful well off? Plato, or Socrates in book 1 of the Republic, very unsatisfyingly tries to respond to that view, but ends up showing that if that's the vision of what those moral rules are, those moral rules don't earn our concern. And then the book goes on, and another character says, here's a different view. Morality isn't a construct used to exploit us. It's what any smart person would put in place, unless she's a god among men. If she's a god among men, she won't worry about justice, but real human beings recognize we're all better off if we put in place certain sets of rules. So that's another way to think morality is a construct, but now it's not an oppressive set of rules. It's a set of rules within which we stand the possibility of flourishing. So Hobbes famously, centuries later, said in A State of Nature, without such rules, life is nasty, brutish, and short. But if you can be lucky enough to be, among others, willing to restrain themselves, we all do better. So that's how I would start. And then I'd worry, is that all there is to morality? Is it this kind of mutual adjustment for individual advantage, or is there more to be said for it? But that's the first thing I'd say is the right rules of justice we all benefit from.
As far as I found out, you're also preoccupied with the idea of voting. Well, voting in elections, voting in a referendum, for example. Do we have to vote? Why should we do it?
So there is what I often refer to as a clear-eyed, cold-hearted analysis of voting that comes to the conclusion, in large-scale elections, nobody should bother. The argument is, in large-scale elections, the chance that your vote will make a difference to the outcome, vanishingly small.
So you ask yourself, why should I
bother? Right.
Why should I bother? Okay.
There's other good things I could do. I could have a pizza. I had some lovely pizza here, by the way. Sitting out in the evening with the beer and pizza. I took real satisfaction in that evening.
Good.
Why should I bother? But then people say, well, let's warm the heart a little bit. Let's have you care about doing your role. Let's have you care about what other people think of you. And sure enough, if we add things that you care about, exercising your right, exactly. Those may be things that you value that now you might say, well, they're reasons to vote regardless of the outcome. And I think those are all compelling. A co-author of mine, an economist named Jeff Brennan, is rightly famous for an analysis of voting that treats it as largely expressive. So a lot of what we're doing in voting is not engaging in an action to ensure an outcome, but expressing our view of the competitors. Mm-hmm. It's a lot like what one does at a football game, soccer or American football. You cheer for your team. There's no sense that you're cheering. I mean, actually, when you're involved in the cheering, you sometimes feel like my cheering is helping my team win, but nobody in their right mind really believes it makes all that much difference. But you still cheer out of support. That's an expressive view.
Right, but you could also vote blank.
You absolutely can vote blank, and that's a way to express. Now, there's two questions. When you vote blank, are you voting your unwillingness to support either option? Are you engaging in a public act that others will see that you voted, but you don't want to actually register either way? The psychology of it is very interesting. I think, in fact, there's all sorts of interesting stories of why people actually vote, including being caught in the view that, well, if I don't and my candidate loses, I won't be able to live with myself. And that thought, I think, motivates a lot of people too. And it's not the thought that my voting will help them win, it's that my not voting will be a cause of appropriate guilt.
Voting matters.
Yeah, in these ways, all these ways. But in a paper that I co-wrote with Jeff Brennan, we explore ways in which it can matter to be part of the cause. So your vote may not be decisive, but it may still matter to you to be part of the group that helped bring about some result. So as just an analogy, let's suppose you're in a romantic relationship.
Just suppose.
Suppose.
Okay.
I don't know enough to.
Okay.
I'm not presuming.
Okay.
Just suppose. I also suppose you care about your partner's happiness. But there's a difference between somebody else making your partner happy and you making your partner happy that matters to you.
Yep.
So being part of the cause of your partner's happiness is something that matters to you, not just whether your partner is happy. In the same way, in elections, in a community you're a part of, yeah, you care about the result of the election. Yeah, you care about expressing things. Yeah, you might be worried about feeling guilty, but you also care to be part of making a good thing happen. Just a part of, not the decisive part.
Again, that leads us to our next question. Some people will say, in a cynical manner, and I'll give a hard, practical example. You give the right to vote for everybody, you get President Donald Trump. Some others will say, President Donald Trump is the result of an intellectual failure of the elite, an elite that lost contact with the real world. And this is a question for the professor and for the citizen as well. Is it okay for everybody to vote?
So there are different ways you can think about this. One is, does allowing everyone to vote get you the best results? And there's, interestingly, a lot of nice literature on what's called the wisdom of the crowds that shows for all sorts of questions, large numbers of people forming an opinion does better than experts. And that's quite an important phenomenon to pay attention to. And it's not just when the question is about the people voting. I mean, there are how many balls are in an urn kind of questions that under certain circumstances, asking a large audience is more likely to get you the right answer than asking experts. So one thing I want to say is, one of the things voting is meant to do is get you the benefits, whatever they are, of wisdom of the crowds. But it's also clear that who votes is not evenly distributed in the ways that the wisdom of the crowd phenomenon depends on. So a lot of elections are, yes, determined by allowing everyone to vote, but in fact, not everyone voting. So you have to worry about that phenomenon. And so one thing worth thinking about is, if you're going to give everyone the right to vote, can you create a context in which most people, at least, actually exercise that right? And then the different question is that enough? Or do you want to build in conditions, qualifications to exercise that right? And there could be two ways you do that, either by having requirements on getting the right or having expectations of everyone who has the right. The worry about the first approach, where you say, first you prove to me you're qualified to vote and then I'll let you vote, is that very quickly, historically, turns into a hugely exploitative institutional structure.
That's very true.
Where you just rule out whole groups. So I think, independent of any particular result and the thought, oh, better if informed people vote, you have to worry about the moral consequences of a test for being qualified to vote.
Okay, but how do you, as a citizen, not necessarily as
a philosopher or an academic. Yeah.
How do you think of this very practical situation?
One group says of these pseudo-intellectuals, these stupid pseudo-intellectuals, they don't even know what they're doing.
They're artificial, they're detached from the real world, and more than that, they are always in a hypocritical position.
Right. So that's one view, and then you say, here's a view, here are these stupid, ignorant people who don't care about this.
Irresponsible, stupid, non-educated, they don't know what they do.
And I'm inclined to say both views are, at least to some obvious degree, right. And in decrying ignorance, stupidity, hypocrisy, they're right. But they're both wrong in thinking of whole groups, that that's the right characterization of either group. And it's certainly a mistake to think of members of each group, they don't bring tremendous value to the country we're in. Now that doesn't lead you to any particular conclusion, but it is honestly my judgment of those kind of broad brush condemnations. We held a very nice event recently for two people. One's a well-known, in North Carolina, the state I'm in, political conservative. He runs a think tank that's quite conservative. And the other is a well-known liberal. She used to be the head of a foundation that's quite liberal. And they decided to start a program for North Carolina leaders. This isn't a leadership program. It's not training leaders. It takes current leaders in North Carolina, in the legislature, in business, in think tanks, in nonprofits, and brought them together for a year to answer one question together that they all thought was important.
What's that question?
How can we ensure that North Carolinians have a living wage? And they're very different views about that, though everybody agrees it's important to do in one way or another. They described, so they've had this year of experience. The PPE program brought them in to talk about that experience. It was under the rubric, building bridges. And the first thing they nicely said was, of course, you only need to build bridges when there isn't a common ground. And they selected the participants precisely because they didn't have a common ground. Then what the program did, this is the series of steps they went through. They started by showing videos and telling personal stories that made vivid the challenges of a living wage. And just made it a personal engagement for everybody in the room. Then the next stage was to articulate, I think they called it presuppositions.
Okay.
But these were really everybody in the room expressing their starting view, which, if they hadn't already built a personal relationship, the expression of the personal view would have repelled other people. You know, they just say, well, I think there ought to be an unrestrained free market. That's the only way everyone can make a living wage. And other people say, oh no, we need a minimum wage that's at least 30% higher than it is now. And they feel at loggerheads. But against the background of the personal relationship, they were able to express their starting points successfully. No agreement of any sort yet. Then they moved to getting a mutual fact set. So they asked a question they really hadn't asked in detail. What is a living wage? How much does someone in North Carolina need to make, given the cost of transportation, of housing, of feeding, to count as having a living wage? And they actually investigated that. And then they asked questions, if a single parent has 2 kids, what quality of childcare should be available to that parent to count as having enough to have a living wage? Should they have as much as it takes to get a premier or a basic childcare, a few hours, more hours? And apparently a lot of time was spent on that. They came to an agreement about key facts, and then they moved to public policy and what different policies' implications would be. And then at the end, they came up with a shared view that they all signed on about how to address this problem, with many people along the way changing aspects of their view.
But in terms of politics, this is quite a success.
Absolutely. Now, it doesn't get people all agreeing, but it gets people of very different views talking fruitfully about central issues. That's what I think is so essential in the situation you just described, where groups are condemning each other instead of trying to figure out how can we talk fruitfully together about things we all acknowledge are important. And that's one of the main points of a well-constructed PPE program, is
Let's
to
say
give that
PPE
tools.
means philosophy, politics, and economics.
Exactly. And in that order, I insist.
Okay, my last question. How will you answer to a Romanian listening to your discourse about this meeting in between liberals and conservatives and telling you something like this? Professor, I respect your point of view, but this is a preoccupation of a society which lives a boring life inside the essence of welfare. Here in Romania, this is very different. You live very well, so you can afford yourself to be bored with such problems. How will you answer to that?
Well, I don't know enough to know how to understand that description. I got the sense from your earlier description of opposing points of view that that was also true here.
You're right.
And if it's true here, then the problem that I'm entertaining myself with is a problem you guys have. You have opposing groups, who each of which thinks the other is deeply confused, and the challenge for a healthy political situation is figuring out how to talk fruitfully together. I don't think this is just a luxury of the well-off. I think it's a problem you have in a family, If you have kids who are not getting along, you have to figure out how to make it so that they can talk fruitfully together about what they're disagreeing with. In a small agrarian community, now often hierarchies settle it. And if hierarchies settle it, you don't have the problem till whoever's at the top leaves. But as soon as you lose that, then you've got the problem. So my first reaction is, but again, this is from ignorance about Romania.
Yep.
My first reaction is, I bet you this is actually a real problem here, and figuring out how to overcome it would be tremendously valuable politically in Romania. At the same time, I recognize in the United States...
Provided your interest, your real interest for the community exists.
Exactly, exactly. And that's not always true. There can be contexts where you have no real interest in being in a community with this group. But holding that steady for Romania, supposing this is a community that has reason to be in community with each other, I think it's a real challenge. But it is true that its nature is very different when you're just trying to get enough to live versus having enough to live and just trying to make it even better. And we're in the luxury, most people, certainly not everyone in North Carolina, but of things are pretty good and we're trying to make them better.
Yep.
But when they're not pretty good, political institutions matter all the more because they're one of the key potential resources to make them better. Mm-hmm. But I think Romania has experience of that not going well when it's the wrong political institutions. So there's this combination of there's a potential resource here that will make everybody better off if we can get it right. And there's the temptation, each caught in the thought, I'm just in it for myself because this is a rat race, trying to just control the politics to advantage them. I think in the long term, that's disastrous. But it's very hard to find the structures to keep people from doing that.
You can say that again.
So,
thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have you as a guest in our show.
Well, I've been honored to be here. Thank you so much.
Tuturor celor care au încredere în această emisiune, le mulțumim frumos. Le mulțumesc ca de fiecare dată prietenilor de la Centrul de Cercetare în Etici Aplicate, de la Facultatea de Filozofie a Universității din București, pentru mijlocirea întâlnirilor de felul ăsta. Ne vedem data viitoare. Noapte bună!